These lectures are not designed for use as medical references to diagnose, treat, or prevent medical or mental health illnesses or trauma. If you have questions about the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of a medical condition or mental illness, you should consult your personal physician or other mental health professional.
Keith Jarrett is one of the most successful jazz pianists of all time. Near the apex of his career, he was hired to play in the first ever jazz performance given at the Opera House in Cologne, Germany. However, only hours before the performance, the panicked organizers discovered that the piano was broken. The baby grand was too small, some of the keys didn't work, the pedals stuck, and it was out of tune. The organizer, a 17-year-old woman named Vera Brandis, went after this notorious perfectionist and convinced him to play anyway. The event turned out to be his most famous concert ever, with 1,400 people in the audience. And when a live recording of the concert was released, it became the best-selling jazz piano album of all time. And it still is today, nearly 40 years later, out-of-tune piano and all. Welcome to today's lecture on perfectionism, a common but sometimes vexing habit that can cause quite a bit of distress in both you and those you love. Do things in your life have to be just so? Do you find yourself feeling impatient and irritable? Let's see what we can do. Perfectionism is a personality trait characterized by a person striving for flawlessness and setting high performance standards, accompanied by critical self-evaluations and concerns regarding others' evaluations. Perfectionism can manifest in three domains. There's self-oriented perfectionism, where you believe that you have to be perfect. There's other-oriented perfectionism, where you believe that others have to be perfect. And there's socially prescribed perfectionism, or perceiving unrealistic expectations of perfection from others toward you. It implies a high-stress control freak who can't relax. Perfectionists have a reputation of being relentless, uncompromising, never satisfied. In fact, a group of Olympic athletes was asked the following question: would you take a pill that would ensure your victory, a gold medal, but kills you in 5 years? 50% of elite athletes would be willing to die for the ultimate perfection, winning a gold medal. As it turns out, perfectionists can also be quite successful. Rolling Stone calls Bruno Mars a pop perfectionist. Serena Williams self-identifies as a perfectionist. Steve Jobs was a notorious perfectionist. But at what cost? And do these outliers justify perfectionism for you and for me? Well, what are some of the costs? Well, of course, there's anger, irritability, impatience, stress, abrasiveness, rigidity, being over-controlling, overly critical, procrastinating, or being indecisive. And remember that it can be self-directed or directed at others. We might also believe that others are having these thoughts about us. It's that report card that's never, ever enough. A likely road that leads to depression, eating disorders, anxiety, or just feeling stressed out all the time. What makes perfectionism especially toxic is that it uses a negative problem orientation. It isn't about savoring our successes. It's that gut-churning desperation to avoid failure and disapproval, to do so much, to be so good that people have to love you. Let's circle back and think about Amanda in her job search. What assumptions do you think she's made about her self-worth or about her parents' love for her? Let's pick this up in the next clip.
Even, and I know this is a small example, when you came in and your papers were folded, you seemed a little uncomfortable that you had folded them and they weren't pristine and perfect the way they were supposed to be.
Yeah.
Okay. So we know, and it's one of those habits of mine. It's really common, but we know sometimes it can be a real driver to do a good job. Other times it can sort of undermine our efforts. Have you heard the saying that perfect is the enemy of the good?
No, I've never heard that before.
Well, it's the idea that if we're only accepting perfection, sometimes we won't accept things that are good enough. And it's that good enough, I think, that probably makes folks who are perfectionists feel a little uncomfortable because, well, it's not perfect.
Right.
So you circled one, and the instructions say to circle the hot thought. And the hot thought is the one that has a big charge to it, but it's also the one that you would like to use for the rest of the exercise, to really start looking for evidence for or against, to start classifying in terms of possible cognitive distortions, and maybe to eventually rewrite or re-rate the emotion. So what's the one that you circled there?
So the one that I circled was that it's not good enough, that it has to be perfect.
Okay. So it's the perfectionism one that you circled. So why don't we talk a little bit about that? And in this situation, you said the behavioral outcome is that you decided not to apply for jobs that day. And do you think that perfectionism was a driver there because your applications weren't perfect? You just...
Yeah, I mean, I felt like, the information that I'm putting into the applications, that wasn't perfect, that wasn't meeting the ideal that the prospective employer is looking for. And so because I feel like, my experience level isn't exactly what they're asking for, or, that sort of thing, that why should I even bother if it's not going to be exactly what they're saying that they want? Why even put myself out there?
Right. So there's a couple of different ways to challenge those kinds of thoughts. And I think first is important to remember that those sorts of thoughts are thoughts, right? Thoughts aren't the gospel truth. They're not facts, they're just thoughts, they're opinions. So you have an opinion about the quality of your resume, and you have an opinion about your goodness of fit for a particular position, and you have a prediction that it won't work because you're not good enough to be hired by them. And those are all things that we can test out, that we should push back against. So you have a particular view, we call it automatic because it comes in uninvited, it just sort of pops to mind. So we need to roll up our sleeves and do a little bit of work to see other potential perspectives, which might be equally valid and might in the end be more helpful or more constructive, because ultimately it gets you to apply for jobs and to eventually get a job. Right now this derailed you and you weren't able to apply for a job. So some of those strategies, the first is to think about habits of mind, and we've talked for a couple sessions about how we all have thinking shortcuts. Sometimes we over-personalize, sometimes we over-generalize, sometimes we only focus on things that are negative or only focus on things that are positive. As you look at that statement, it's not good enough, it has to be perfect. Are there any sort of habits of mind there that might be shaping that thought?
So it's great that Amanda has high standards and wants to do her best, but it appears that her perfectionism has stopped her in her tracks. If she never applies for a job, then she'll certainly never get one, and in a way she'll be confirming her negative core belief that she's just not good enough. Here, we've already selected the tool we're going to use, the thought record, and all the micro skills that will entail, capturing the trigger, the emotion intensity, and the automatic thoughts. To do something about the automatic thoughts, we'll need to employ one of our cognitive restructuring techniques, looking for evidence for or against, decentering, or looking for habits of mind. Let's see where she went with it.
Can you think of other life events with you or, I don't know, your brother, your parents, others, where perfection maybe was or wasn't present?
Yeah, I think, both my parents are really well respected in their individual career paths, and there was always a lot of pressure placed on both me and my brother to not just do well, but do better than everyone else, be the best at everything. And so, we were constantly told that, well, because you're Black, you're going to have to work twice as hard than anyone else to be able to attain the same goals. So it was constantly ingrained in us as kids that, good is good, but you want to be the best. You have to be the best. And so I think that that's where a lot of that comes in for me, is just that recognizing that I have to be the best. Otherwise, it's not going to matter. If I'm not the best, if I'm not the person who's at the top of the heap, no one's going to care,
Yeah. So I like how you're taking this it's really a family of thoughts around perfectionism, and you're sort of expanding out to influences that help us understand why those thoughts are there and what might be maintaining those kinds of thoughts. So, all of our thoughts occur inside our head, and they're individual, and we can do an individual thought record, and, we can think of it as an individual. But of all the automatic thoughts you had those. So we know that there's reasons for that, and oftentimes it's our family of origin, our parents. You describe your parents, they're successful, and they had high expectations, and they kind of pushed you, right? Put some pressure on you, and so that helps us explain part of why that's there. But you expanded it out even beyond your immediate nuclear family and talked about society as a whole and the assumptions that we make about people based on their gender. She's a woman, she can't do science, or about race, or about age, or whatever it might be. And again, those beliefs, even if we don't agree with them, they can still have this insidious effect of making us doubt ourselves. And your parents, who have also lived, in a society with those sorts of beliefs, have tried to impart to you, hey, you got to step it up and be twice as good if you want to be successful. So all those layers are at play. And I think in terms of a thought record, the easiest person, really the only person we can change is you, right? And you can change the way that you think about situations. But I think wise mind would include, but this is my family history and this is the world in which I live. So where's the most comfortable, helpful, functional place that I can be and that I can think about myself? And I know part of the struggle, I think, in living in a world that doesn't maybe value you the way you value yourself is still having that inner steel, that inner resilience to say, well, you make your assumptions, but I'm a different person, and I'm going to show you that I'm a different person.
We started with looking for evidence for and against the need to be perfect. She veered off into pressure from successful parents who told her she had to be the best, especially since she's Black and she's a woman. She shared the deeper conditional assumption, if I'm not the best, then it won't matter. I like how she took the family of thoughts around perfectionism and looked at influences in maintaining factors, sexism and racism. She noted that she can't change the world, but she could change the way that she thought about herself. Go ahead. Have your assumptions. I'm going to prove you wrong. That was her inner steel. As it happens sometimes, her thought record got a little sidetracked, but we went with it because it seemed productive. If she had continued with evidence for and against, she might have come up with past examples of being imperfect but still being successful, like with her college admissions essays, or scoring well but imperfectly on exams that she took during college. Later, we go on to talk about successful people and all the imperfections that they have too. We never quite get to how our imperfections can also be our greatest asset, but more on that later. Let's take a step back and allow you to do some self-assessments regarding perfectionism. Remember that it isn't just about having high standards or being ambitious or even having a critical eye. Technically, perfection is impossible. It's that star on the horizon that we can strive for but will never reach. Striving can bring us success, but it can also lead to procrastination, a tendency to put tasks off, avoid challenges, to think rigidly. It can also create a hypercritical eye that erodes our self-confidence and can damage our relationships. And if you're a parent, can undermine the self-esteem of your children who are never quite good enough. Remember the three domains of perfectionism. Self-oriented perfectionism, where you have to be perfect, other-oriented perfectionism, where others have to be perfect, and socially prescribed perfectionism, or perceiving unrealistic expectations of perfection from others. Amanda seems to have both self and socially prescribed perfectionism, both of which have important automatic thoughts and conditional assumptions attached to them, and both of which can be challenged with cognitive restructuring. Do you expect yourself to be perfect in all domains or in just a certain domain like work or relationships? Do you expect others to be perfect? Your spouse, your kids, your boss, your coworkers? Do you think others expect you to be perfect at work or at home? And if you're not, what are the consequences? Here are 9 subtle signs of perfectionism taken from Ellen Hendrickson in Psychology Today. Hint or sign number 1, You always look great. Sign number 2, you don't share your ideas until they're ready. Sign number 3, you live by lists. Sign 4, it's really hard to relax. 5, you can only concentrate if everything is in its rightful place. 6, you procrastinate. 7, you do one of 2 things when it comes to decision making. You're either completely indecisive or you're overly certain and rigid. 8, you have a lot of trouble delegating. And sign number 9, you hate waste. So what can you do about it? Well, the intervention depends on what you think is driving the behavior and what you see as the biggest costs that you'd like to address. For Amanda, we saw that she was procrastinating about her job search. She believed that each application had to be absolutely perfect. We used a thought record, and we did a variant of exposure therapy. When thinking about your own perfectionism, go back to the CBT toolbox. Exposure with response prevention is a likely choice from the behavioral compartment. Here, you intentionally do things or sit with things that are imperfect. You learn to unclench around them and maybe even enjoy them. Make things asymmetrical and leave them that way. Dress sloppy and don't fix your hair one day. Delegate a task to someone that won't do it as well as you, but refrain from any instruction or criticisms. I can almost see all of us perfectionists cringing. Another tool from the cognitive side might be using a thought record to do cognitive restructuring or digging a little deeper to uncover conditional assumptions that you might be able to address in a worksheet. Do you believe that love and acceptance from others depends on you being perfect? Find evidence for and against that belief. What would a more balanced thought be? You might also try problem-solving therapy. Are you procrastinating because of perfectionism? Use PST to define the problem, generate possible solutions, and then to test them out. Let's add 2 new tools to our toolbox that may help with perfectionism. The first is called standard setting, and the second is called planned imperfection. For standard setting, we prospectively, in advance, set a bar, a performance standard that we need to reach for a particular task to be successful. With Amanda, we had her set the total number of job applications that she needed to send out per day or per week, regardless of whether or not they were perfect. Once you've made this goal, you're done. So setting the right goal is important. It's okay to stretch yourself a little bit, but carefully think about the importance of the task first, the resources and the time that you have. For menial tasks, house cleaning, yard work, grocery shopping, you might set a time limit since these tasks are never really completely done. I'm the yard work guy at home, but there's a lot to do, so I set aside 1 hour per Saturday and just do as much as I can. It doesn't have to be perfect. At work, make sure you know what the performance standard is. Is there a set due date? Is there a productivity metric of some sort? Is it realistic and necessary? Some standards will be set by others, but we can always set our own standards too. Just be sure they are necessary. The next strategy is planned imperfection, and this takes us back to those exposure exercises. You have a task that maybe isn't so important, and you plan for the outcome to be imperfect. Then you sit with the discomfort. That's the exposure part. What would you choose? The Japanese have a term called wabi-sabi that refers to the art of embracing imperfection. It's based in Zen Buddhism and has roots that go all the way back to the ancient tea ceremonies, where a tea master performs a very precise ritual, but does it with intentionally misshapen and imperfect bowls. It's about embracing the beauty in the imperfect, about appreciating flaws. So those fingerprints on the wall at home, not a problem. The cake that stuck to the pan, well, it probably tastes the same or even better. In Lecture 9, we talked about the importance of self-compassion and even being compassionate if we aren't yet compassionate. Perfectionism is another area where we need to build compassion for ourselves and for others. We're evolutionarily predisposed to nitpick at our failings, yet doing so makes us insecure and possibly anxious or sad. Self-compassion, the practice of being kind and understanding to ourselves when confronted with a personal flaw or failure, can be an essential antidote for when we fall short of perfect. Kristen Neff, a self-compassion researcher, tells us that research shows that the #1 barrier to self-compassion is fear of being complacent and fear of losing your edge. But all the research shows that that's just not true. In fact, it's the opposite, meaning that self-compassion is actually associated with greater achievement when compared to harsh self-criticism. Although it may sound paradoxical, research has shown that self-acceptance, not self-flagellation, is the best strategy to improve performance. Of course, it depends on the issue and depends on the context, but in general, taking a step back, using some somatic quieting, repeating some self-acceptance coping statements will get you further on your next attempt. Think of it as parenting. You'll need limits, but you need a whole lot of love and acceptance too. Let's move now to talk about a related and important concept, particularly when we are thinking about perfectionism directed towards our expectations of others. Here I'm talking about patience, or the lack thereof, being impatient. Do slow drivers make you crazy? Do you speed up audio playback to 1.25 because you hate slow talkers? Does the chatty checker at the grocery store irritate you? It's about patience and about imperfection. Patience is defined as the ability to keep calm in the face of disappointment, distress, or suffering. It's associated with a number of positive health outcomes, such as reducing depression, stress, and even anxiety. Patient people exhibit more pro-social behaviors like empathy and are more likely to be generous and compassionate. The good news is that even though patience has been described as a personality trait, it's modifiable. Even if you're not a particularly patient person today, there's still a chance for improvement tomorrow. So if you find yourself getting exasperated more than you'd like, here are a few ways to keep those testy impulses in check. First, you need to identify your triggers. M.J. Ryan, the author of The Power of Patience, tells us that impatience is the fight component of the fight or flight response. Our amygdala, those midbrain structures responsible for sussing out threats, are telling us that we need to step up and fight. While this was probably adaptive at some point in our prehistoric past, it's a misfire in the modern world. As a result, we overreact to minor triggers as if they were life and death. The amygdala, Ms. Ryan says, is too unsophisticated to know the difference between a true danger, say a growling tiger, and something substantially less life-threatening, like dealing with a slow person. So what are your triggers? Figure out which situations set you off. Is it those careless drivers, technological glitches, slow-moving coworkers? And you've taken your first step to becoming more patient. Next, take a step back and perform a balanced assessment of the risk presented by that trigger. Here you'll use your cognitive restructuring tools. Did the trigger unleash any automatic thoughts? Well, probably. Is there an associated image? Well, maybe. Figure out the automatic thought, then start filling in the 7-column thought record. And since this tends to be a repetitive pattern, be sure you save that thought record. You'll want to create a compilation of more balanced thoughts to review later in order to build your skills with patience. Next, be sure to use reappraisals and reattributions. If you're annoyed by a chatty neighbor, try creating a different narrative. Why might they be reaching out to connect with you? What might this conversation be providing to them? Have there been times when maybe you were feeling a little lonely too and just needed some conversation? Maybe it's a good opportunity to show grace or kindness. We all need it, and we can all give it with practice. And that brings me to our next point. Practice, practice, practice. The same has been true for most of the skills that we've talked about throughout the course. But here it's particularly important because we might get impatient with our impatience. This habit has probably been around for a long time, so give yourself some time to gradually change it, and be sure to concurrently use your emotion regulation skills. Are you practicing self-management, stress management? Are you reducing arousal with somatic quieting? And finally, be realistic. It seems like there's more pressure to do more and more and more each and every day. It's ever present. You did 10 things today? Well, you should do 11 tomorrow. But is that reasonable? Is it realistic? Where is that pressure coming from? If your to-do list has 10 items on it, but you can only reasonably accomplish 5, then you're sabotaging yourself. Any inconvenience has the potential to throw you off the track, and your day is planned down to the minute. You might even try having an unscheduled day. This will sound funny, but I schedule unscheduled times, sometimes a few hours or sometimes an entire weekend. The plan is to have no plan. Niksen, Niksen, is the Dutch concept of doing nothing. It's a stress relief technique that I think can also help us work out with our perfectionism and impatience. It's a little hard to imagine doing nothing since it always seems like we're doing something. Dr. Doreen Dodgen-McGee, a psychologist who studies boredom, compares Niksen to a car whose engine is running, but it isn't going anywhere. She thinks of boredom as the moment when we have no plan, we just are. More practically, the idea of Niksen is to take conscious, considered time and energy to do activities like gazing out of a window or sitting motionless. Does this sound lazy? Indolent? Probably. But let's just suspend disbelief for now. Think about the demands that our current world places on us, particularly with technology where you can never really unplug. Email? Yep, you're now expected to read it over the weekend or even when you're waiting for the elevator. Text messages? Yep, they seem to come nonstop, and you're always supposed to reply. And think about all those productivity apps that just won't leave you alone, like Slack or Asana. We need a space, a time when we can literally and figuratively unplug. After all, this go, 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 go is rewiring our brains, and we need to push back a little. In fact, research has found that daydreaming, an inevitable effect of idleness, literally makes us more creative, better at problem solving, and better at coming up with creative ideas. When was the last time you allowed yourself to have a daydream? Olga Mecking, a science writer from the Netherlands, gives us these helpful tips in her article, The Art of Doing Nothing. First, resist the culture of busyness. If you're doing nothing, own it. When someone asks you what you're doing during a nothing break, simply respond, nothing. Be unapologetic about taking breaks or holidays. And if you start to feel guilty about being seen as lazy, think of Niksen not as a sign of laziness, but as an important life skill. Choose the initial discomfort of Niksen over the familiarity of busyness. Second, manage your expectations. Learning to do nothing will take time and effort. Ironically, so don't get discouraged. Now that sitting still might actually be uncomfortable at first, and it might take practice, just like exercise. Third, reorganize your environment. Your home should be a Niksen-friendly place. We recently moved to a new home, and now we have a place where we sequester digital devices. We have comfy furniture that is oriented towards a fireplace or a window. The television is in a closet downstairs. And lastly, think outside of the box. If you can't sit still in your home or workplace, go to the park, the library, or go enjoy a sauna or a spa. Dr. Dodgen-McGee encourages people to host boredom parties, during which a host invites over a few friends so that they can all be bored together. Interesting. Test it out. So what have we added to our toolbox today? We've added some essential knowledge, outlined a process of standard setting and scheduling and perfection, and we've provided several examples of how to use our existing CBT tools to challenge perfectionistic thinking. We've added in the new skills of having patience and Niksen, the art of doing nothing. Please join us next time when we turn to the challenge of procrastination. I hope to see you soon. Thank you.